All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Eli. Appreciate it. Good to be with you all this morning. I'm Andrea Vernon, and I'm the Executive Director here with Montana Campus Compact. And I also serve at the University of Montana in the role of Acting Executive Director of Experiential Learning and Career Success. And I teach in our Department of Public Administration and Policy. I teach in our nonprofit administration program. So I'm excited to be with all of you today and to be able to talk today about creating community awareness and building stakeholder involvement. These are important aspects of working in communities and in nonprofit organizations specifically as well. So I hope that you find the information compelling and applicable, and it'll be nice to be able to, put out some information for you all, and then have some discussion along the way. In addition to sharing information, I want to hear from all of you too. So we'll be using the chat room or the chat bar for some give and take, I guess, of information sharing. So we're really excited to have you all participating in our Community Building Institute. This is an annual project we do a couple times a year, actually, and it's great to be able to reach a wide audience with the kind of information that we feel like really hits the, hits an important marker with regard to community-based work. So thanks again for being here. All right, I'm going to try to share my screen here and see if I can do this successfully and get the right screen on as well. So let me start with this. And this is where from the beginning. Okay, so now I need to know which screen you're seeing.
Yep, we're currently seeing your presentation.
Okay, perfect. All right, then let me pull down this one and pull up this. Okay, you still see the presentation?
Yes, we do.
Awesome, thank you. It's difficult with two screens, and PowerPoint seems to want to take up both screens, it seems like. So appreciate the technical support there. All right, let me see if I can advance through. Oh, that's where I'm going to run into a problem. Bear with me one more second, please. Okay, there we go. All right, so the agenda for today is to be able to talk about who our stakeholders are, who they are, why they're important for our organization, what are some of the roles and functions of stakeholders in the work that we do, and then we'll transition and shift into talking about some key communication strategies that we can use with our stakeholder groups to help educate them, actually engage them in our work, and turn them into champions and advocates for our work as well. So that's kind of what we're looking at for the agenda for today's presentation. And I will dive into the next slide here if it lets me. Okay, perfect. I think I've got it rolling. Okay, so to start with, we'll take a look at who our stakeholders are. A stakeholder technically is defined as any group, person, or organization that can place a claim on an organization's attention, their resources, or output, or is affected by that output from the organization. So they're people who essentially play a role in helping the organization to achieve its goals and objectives. And stakeholders have needs and expectations that can be internal or external to your organization. So the list here is a type of, a set of examples, I guess, of types of stakeholders that exist for nonprofit organizations. So first of all, of course, our clients or our customers. Who are we serving in our nonprofit organization? Funders and donors, employees, so those people who are paid by the organization and work there as staff members. The board of directors, which governs the organization and is responsible for the fiduciary oversight of nonprofits. Certainly our volunteers. Many of us rely heavily on volunteers. Other nonprofit organizations, so who do we partner with? Who do we collaborate with? Another stakeholder that we don't often think about are banks or lending agencies that might be holding mortgages on our buildings or lines of credit for us to tap into when we need to. And also suppliers, so those businesses or partners that supply us with food, equipment, shippers, any sort of project supplies, that type of thing. So this list is pretty broad. So this is where I get into difficulty with two screens. So the list, as you can see, is pretty broad. And so thinking about who stakeholders are in a broad context, though, I think is really valuable because it helps to identify the various webs and interrelationships from both the internal and the external environment that the organization exists and operates in. Also, taking a broad perspective of stakeholders helps the organization to stay in check with its ethical and democratic accountability responsibilities. So it's necessary for the organization to be aware of and kind of continuously assess and clarify who and what counts to remain focused on the mission and to be effective, and to really uphold the public's trust in that social contract that exists between nonprofit organizations and government organizations and the communities that they serve. So that stakeholder awareness is really critical for a variety of different reasons. One thing I'd like to start with then with the chat is to ask you all, who are the stakeholders of your organization right now that you may have interacted with already so far during your service or your work with the organization? And in addition to that, can you think of other organizations or other stakeholders rather that aren't quite listed here? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat. So just go ahead and list in the chat. Who are the stakeholders you've interacted with so far? And are there additional ones, broader categories that aren't currently represented on that list? All right. Students of the Board of Regents, Montana colleges and high schools. Awesome. Families with ages 0 to 5 in Gallatin. Nice. Okay. Students. Community Development Board. Employees and students. Great. Executive Board of the college. Awesome. Teachers. Let's see. Good. Lots of ideas here. Nonprofits, higher ed institutions, poverty population, Rotary clubs. Great. All right. Students, banks. Awesome. School districts, student interns, student workers, food pantry partners. Terrific. All right, so I see some definite themes in there just at a first glance. Definitely students and college and university partners, other community partners, employees. A couple of people have interacted with the board. That's great. I would definitely encourage you to attend a board meeting if you can. That's always helpful insight into how the organization works, and it's great to be able to meet board members of the organizations where you're serving. Okay, great. Homeowners, credit unions, nonprofits. Board of Regents, county commissioners, nice. Okay, great. All right, survivors, Department of Health, advocates, membership programs. Okay, wonderful. Well, you're already all interfacing quite a bit then with boards, which is definitely you know, an important aspect as you're getting started, or even when you're already you know, fully immersed in your work. So those are great examples. Thank you for sharing those. All right, let's see. I'll go to the next slide here. So the importance of stakeholders then, obviously, being aware of and analyzing the various groups of stakeholders of an organization is a really important exercise to understand the networks and the politics that surround an organization. An understanding of these types of relationships, whether they are either actual or potential, help define the organization's context for operating, and can also provide valuable clues for you to identify effective communication, programming, and funding strategies. In addition, stakeholders often will hold influence over an organization or a program, and this influence can be either positive or negative in some cases. And so once you have identified who your specific stakeholders are, you can identify then their sphere of influence, I like to say, and what you need from them. So identifying those stakeholders, understanding their influence, and then recognizing what you're asking for from that stakeholder, whether it's their money, their time, their political clout or political support, connections perhaps to other people or other important programs that might help your organization and could help build your capacity for networking. So when you know this information about your stakeholders and your stakeholder groups, you can prioritize then who to reach out to and how to engage with them and when to engage with them. Because depending on the stakeholder, there might be certain times in the year or in a program cycle that might be more or less important for engaging with your stakeholders. This type of analysis is also helpful to assess the different strategies then to communicate with and engage stakeholders depending on the kind of influence that they hold and what you need from them. So that's why it's important to know your stakeholders really well. So a next chat question, I will stop sharing my screen again so I can see the chat. So this question is, have you seen the influence of stakeholder groups at your organization already? What does that look like? And is it positive or negative? So if you want to think about a particular stakeholder group, if you want to name it, that's fine. And if you want to say positive or negative, I realize we may not want to share specific negatives with stakeholder names. So if you want to be more confidential about that, that's fine. You can just share whether it was a positive or a negative and maybe a brief description of that influence. So if you want to give a minute to think about that and put things up. So what does that influence look like so far from stakeholder groups, and is it positive or negative? So starting off, yeah, so far mostly positive because the stakeholders care about the work of our nonprofit and they want to support it. Good. There's been a push for programming, more programming, so it's been positive. Seeing how the families appreciate what you do in your work has been good. Right, so with the board, determining and overseeing the budget, and that's a lot of power, yeah, that the board has. Yeah, generally lots of collaboration. Okay. Influence both positive. So positive is building partnerships and expanding capacity, and also negative in terms of different college groups disagreeing on the direction. Yeah, that can be challenging when you have a group of stakeholders and they're not in agreement about a path forward. All right, so generally it's positive, that's great. Seeing where community volunteers are helping with the workload for the organization. Great. Yeah, some stakeholders can get their feathers ruffled that somebody else is on their turf. Yeah, that's a big part of stakeholder engagement and stakeholder sort of management, really, is kind of knowing where those turf battles are is really important, because then sometimes you can manage the communication and the outreach and the collaboration between those stakeholders. Okay, fantastic. These are really good examples. Connections with other nonprofits allow us to expand the network. Nice. Great. Supportive, positive action. That's awesome. So those are really good examples of how stakeholder groups are so important for us. All right, let me go back to sharing my screen, see if I can make this work. Let's see, keep showing up on a different part. All right, so another important aspect, as some of you pointed out here in the chat, is stakeholders have their an ability to help you get things done and be effective in your work. And so depending on your size of your nonprofit organization, some nonprofits have really large dependence on stakeholders because they don't have a lot of capacity internally, either because of being all volunteer driven or small staff. But so sometimes small nonprofits can have a much higher dependence on their stakeholders to help them get things done. So that's a really practical and tangible aspect, again, of understanding the importance of stakeholder groups, because without them, sometimes things just would not get done. So working together with your stakeholders, they can help you and your program or organization also develop a deeper understanding of the problem that you're trying to address, and create new and better solutions and build more effective organizations. So there can be some long-term capacity and influence as well. So looking at the types of influences then that stakeholders have over an organization and a program, I think helps to provide a good segue into the next slide here, and our next part of conversation, looking at the roles and functions of stakeholders. So some common functions, of course, are that they would support the organization financially by providing either grants, contracts, connections to contracts sometimes, donations, paying fees for service to the organization, that type of thing if it's clients or people that you're serving. They can provide input and direction on the programming of services based on their base of knowledge and their connections in the particular issue area that your organization is concentrated around serving. They can help you understand the scope of the problem in your community and help build ties with other entities that might be doing similar work to help you maximize the impact of the programs and services that you're offering. So for example, in work that I've done here in Missoula in the past, I was part of a collective impact group working together. And we had multiple stakeholder groups representing government, private business, and nonprofit organizations that were all working together to identify strategies and resources around early childhood education opportunities. So that was really a way to bring together those different sectors of our communities and of our economy to bring different types of resources to the table. Another piece of this is doing the work, your stakeholders obviously can do the work with you or doing certain aspects of the work that you don't do. Like if there's a spectrum of services in your community, for example, I know with housing, some organizations are sometimes providing for the immediate crisis services of a homeless person or a homeless family, and other organizations might be working on more the long-term permanent housing available options or answers to the tough problem or tough question of homelessness and housing. So thinking of your work on that spectrum, how can you figure out where you plug in and where your stakeholder groups plug in to help make sure that all aspects of that spectrum are being covered? All right, so another chat question. Stop sharing my screen. So this question is asking you to identify one critical stakeholder so far that you've worked with and what has been their critical role. So think a little bit deeper. So we're kind of ratcheting down our thought process here in the chat bar. Generally we've looked at stakeholders, looked at their influence. So think of one stakeholder and what has been their critical role as you've experienced it so far in your work. Okay, so they give the go-ahead on project, okay. So a specific stakeholder is the Housing Authority in Billings. They've helped to increase the reach of community assessment, survey distribution, awesome. So they've helped you get your survey out. Governor's office, approving the work, granting funding. Missoula County Public Schools, helping with enrollment and student support for refugees, okay. Awesome, so your supervisors, that's great. They're a critical stakeholder for you now to expand your work and support your work. Okay, the clinicians at the clinic where they partner. Okay, so those would be staff, other employees. Ooh, program alums, I like that. That's a stakeholder group that I didn't have listed on that page. So alumni who can help continue to volunteer and support the organization. That's great. Yeah, the community recognizing issues and the gaps in needs. Great. The local drug court supplying volunteers. That's a good stakeholder group to be part of. Faculty that work directly with clients and can spread the word. Okay, great. Those are some good examples. Last couple here. Board of directors, nice. Publicize the fundraising campaign, great. Wonderful. So the students themselves, the people you're serving as informants of what they need from the organization and the program. Wonderful. Those are all really valuable examples of the uniqueness. And I really, yeah, I'm going to have to add a couple new ones to my list here. All right, let's get into the next slide here. Okay, so the other thing to think about, I guess, before we get into this particular slide is that you need to be able to think about the role of stakeholders changing over time also. So throughout the life cycle, either of a project or a program, there could be different types of stakeholders involved, and the different role, the stakeholders may play a different role at the beginning of a project, the middle of the project, or an end of a project. So in the beginning, a stakeholder such as a donor might help to provide funding to launch a new initiative, and then that same donor may actually turn into a volunteer for the project once it's up and running to help you do the work of that project. So this is another reason why it's really important for you all to think about maintaining a consistent connection and management system for working with stakeholders and building stakeholder relations plans. Continuous and incremental analysis of your stakeholder groups is really important. So now that we put some definition to the and parameters around stakeholders, we can now kind of shift to this more tangible aspect of stakeholders and how we communicate with them through our organizations. And so this slide shows a matrix tool that can help to categorize your stakeholders and help you consider how to manage stakeholder involvement and interest. And so what you'll see on this then is obviously a set of quadrants here based on stakeholders' level of power. So that's along the y-axis here. So do the stakeholders have a high level of power in the organization or a low level of power? And then on the x-axis here, what's their level of interest? Do they have low interest in the program or project or organization, or do they have high interest? So if you can think about those stakeholder groups that you've shared examples of, there are ways then, I mean, you don't have this in front of you, but if you could scribble out maybe a quadrant real quick on a slip of paper and quickly draw the matrix and then go back to your list of stakeholders that you just kind of shared in that chat box and place some of those stakeholders on in these quadrants. So where would you perhaps put the volunteers that some of you mentioned? Where would you put the board? Where would you put the clients or the people that you're serving? Where would you put a collaborating nonprofit organization? Where would you put, what were some of the other examples I remember? The Board of Regents or the school district, the campus, faculty or teachers at the campus or a school. So think about that for just a second and place some stakeholders in this kind of matrix. And one thing to keep in mind then as you're kind of scratching that out. So the group here, your stakeholders that you want to keep satisfied. So these are folks that have a high level of power, but kind of a low level of interest. So these might be employees of an organization, donors, clients. This section down here, these are stakeholders. Well, okay, so go back to here. Those are the kind of stakeholders you want to keep satisfied. They have a high level of power, but low interest. So you want to keep them satisfied and happy with what the organization is doing. For the next quadrant down here, we'll move to the lower left. These are stakeholders with low levels of power and low levels of interest. This is where you just want to be able to monitor these stakeholders and make sure you're staying in check, keeping in contact, and but they're not requiring a lot of your attention and resources. Moving along over here to the right then, when you have stakeholders with a high level of interest but not much power, those are stakeholders you really want to keep informed and keep moving along with the progress of a project or a program. And then of course this group up here, which has high level of power and a high level of interest, in that group of stakeholders you really want to keep them encouraged, and you want to think about the ways in which you need their influence to help the program, the project, the organization. Oops, let me get back. So that is some of the, I guess, the rationale, the thought process that goes behind the table like this is ideally you want to have stakeholders kind of spread out among those quadrants. It's going to be difficult if you have a lot of your stakeholders over here in the encourage and influence area, because they're going to take a high degree of touch points for you and a high degree of communication and management. Whereas stakeholders in this group, like I said, you kind of want to monitor and make sure they have the information they need, but you may not be in contact with these stakeholders very often. So that's a low level contact. These are kind of a split between the two as well. So part of what we want to do with this kind of matrix is to identify, are the stakeholders in the right place at the right time? That's the other thing. Like I mentioned before, stakeholders might move a lot in this quadrant based on the timing of a project or where you're at. So if you think about, are your stakeholders right now in the right quadrants? Why or why not? Should certain stakeholders be in a different part of the matrix? And what do you need to do to move them there? So maybe you have too many stakeholders down here in this monitor group. How do you try to move some of them to these other areas so that they can be more engaged in the work of the organization and become your champions and advocates for the work. So then the other question that comes along with this exercise is, what should your next steps be to manage your stakeholders, to get them into the right boxes and be positioned to really maximize their help with your organization and with your program? Okay, so that's a set of questions that kind of goes along with this particular matrix. And once you identify your stakeholder groups and put them into the matrix, you can really think about moving them toward the next level of engagement with your organization, which is going to be that, that partnership, the advocacy, and the championing of your program. So that really can lay a nice pathway and strategy for you to develop to think about how you want to manage those stakeholders. So the other thing that goes along with that then would be to potentially build out a type of action plan or management plan that would help you achieve your desired expectations of where you want stakeholders to be, especially if you're wanting to switch them around. And so that's another aspect of strategy, I guess, behind this particular tool. All right, we'll move from there and go into the next area. Oh, yes, sorry. Here's my list of questions. I just talked through those, but I wanted to put that out there as well. Okay, so by devising a plan to help move and manage your stakeholders, the plan should really include ways to increase their engagement with you by, first of all, getting their attention. So this is kind of the layer one of how to maintain their attention and bring in new stakeholders too. If through the matrix exercise you realize that you're missing a certain stakeholder audience, how do you initially grab their attention? Then once you have their attention, the next step up here is, how do you actually build their interest in your programs and services within your particular organization? Then how do you increase their desire and their ability to want to be involved with you? What kinds of opportunities can you put in front of those stakeholders to invite them to get involved with you? And then ultimately, what will get them to act? What will get them to become the advocates and champions of the work and the mission that you're trying to move forward with through your organization? So this is a bit of a, again, sort of a trajectory of how to identify stakeholder groups that are currently missing, but to also think about where those stakeholder groups fall on that matrix and where you want to be able to build their interest, their engagement with the organization, and then their action to become an advocate and a champion and an ally with you. All right. Next slide then. So how do we then align various stakeholders around a common vision to achieve the outcome or the change or the impact that you want to see in the community? How do you educate these stakeholders and engage them so they can become those advocates, like I mentioned, and become part of the narrative of your organization and the work that you do? There's a lot of different outreach methods to get started, so I'll kind of talk through some of them. But once you've identified your current and potential stakeholders, then you can concentrate on where your efforts will potentially get the biggest yield on investment. So where you want to really invest your time and energy to get the kind of outcome from stakeholders that you're looking for. So the level of effort needed to educate and engage your stakeholders can vary from one stakeholder group to another. And most of us seldom have the luxury of having enough time and resources to reach them all. So you should really, I would suggest, focusing on your priority areas, your priority target stakeholder groups. So target those people to whom you have the greatest level of access to. That's one way to think about managing time and resources well. And also think about those stakeholders with the influence and resources to actually move your organization's programs and services forward and to potentially become your advocates. So each strategy that you decide to use to educate and engage your stakeholders should be directly tied then to what the stakeholder, who the stakeholder is, and their role and function within your program. So going back to those earlier slides, identifying who they are and what their functions are, and then figuring out where they fall on that power and interest matrix. Because different stakeholder groups will certainly require different engagement strategies. And doing your research about people and organizations that you want to bring in, I think, is another huge aspect of that work as well. And it can also save you a lot of time if you've done some of the research to analyze the appropriate approach that you want to take. And that will yield a better return if you've been able to be strategic about it. Another point I'll make here is that it's important to be aware of the other partners, the people and the organizations you want to bring in. What other partners are they working with in the community? So you can draw connections and similarities to their work and your work, and a third organization's work potentially where it's appropriate. And know if this kind of endeavor will be something entirely new that you're asking them to be involved in, or potentially something that will add value to something they're already currently involved in. Okay. All right. So let's talk more specifically then about strategies to educate stakeholders. And these are, again, going to vary based on your organization type, based on your capacity within your organization and the tools that you have available and resources. But, you know, most basically, some of the outreach tools would look like, you know, the written forms would be things like newsletters, your website, issuance of annual reports, evaluation or performance reports. These all educate stakeholders about what you do, what you've been up to, how your organization has evolved, how you do the things you do, and how effective you are with, especially if you're looking at an annual report type of scenario where you're issuing to the public the impacts that you've been able to have and the outcomes. More participatory forms of reaching out to and educating your stakeholders would be to do things like conducting open forums. A lot of organizations do this where they open their organization to the public so that they can help educate members of the community about what they're doing and invite the public in to learn more. I used to be part of an advisory committee for an after-school program. And so one of the things that we did was each month we offered an open house at this after-school program and invited the public to come in and see what kinds of programming we were doing with kids after school. Some of it was very educational based. Some of it was completely co-curricular, sporting, that kind of thing. So it was really fun for the public to be able to come in and actually get a first-hand viewpoint of the program, what we were doing, how we were impacting the lives of youth, and bring them in, you know, as a first point of educating them. And then again, what are the things we can do now that we've raised their awareness? How can we actually engage with them and get them active in our project? Definitely, obviously, using social media. That kind of goes, you know, that's a pretty obvious one nowadays, obviously. But also reaching out to traditional media sources to help spread the word about a new program or initiative. This will catch the attention, I think, of those who are interested in being part of your organization through the variety of both traditional and social media networks. So think about how you're using things like Twitter or Facebook, Instagram, TikTok now. You know, what kind of audiences are those reaching, and what audiences are you missing from social media, and where do you want to go back to more traditional media outlets like newspapers or newsletters, those types of things. Conducting individual meetings. So this is really, you know, dependent on being able to talk in person with stakeholders and give them information firsthand. This can be a really good approach to appeal to the similarities that you might have with a stakeholder audience and why it's important to work together. In my experience, this individual meeting time can involve multiple meetings with people as you're, you know, initially exposing them or bringing them into the conversation about what you're trying to do. Another meeting to maybe think about how, you know, what are some ways that we could partner. You kind of have to gauge that based on the stakeholders' willingness to come into conversation with you. But it's really, I think, in my experience, it's been a really valuable investment of my time to build support from certain stakeholder groups. Here at the university several years ago, when I was tasked with building a new academic program for nonprofit studies on campus, I met with dozens, literally dozens of professors from various academic departments to inform them about the new program, the new academic program we were building, and invite them into the process to help build it. And part of that was really identifying, again, those areas where we had overlap or similar goals in mind. You can imagine a nonprofit studies program would overlap well, perhaps with the business school or communications department or sociology. There's lots of disciplinary fields that connect to nonprofit work. So my job was really reaching out to those disciplinary fields to gain support, build the awareness first, gain the support, and then I was able to actually create an advisory group of faculty that helped me build out a nonprofit minor here at the University of Montana, because they understood the basis of it, the rationale, the reason behind it, and they understood the connection that their department, their discipline had to this particular new academic program. The drawback of this, of course, is it takes a lot of your time to meet with several different people individually, but that time builds connection, it builds trust, and it builds confidence in the ability to work together. And those are really fundamental building blocks, I think, for sustainable partnerships and support with stakeholder audiences. Other options here would be to attend public meetings where you can actually talk about what your organization is doing. Again, raising awareness to the general public, educating them about what you're doing, and it might help you think about other ways to reach out to people that you wouldn't necessarily come to mind first. But what are some of the public groups? I know one of you listed one of the service clubs. I don't know if it was Rotary or Kiwanis, but sometimes those get overlooked when we're looking at how to build out our stakeholder audience. But those are really important as well. Also attending public meetings, again, it gives you the chance to talk about what you're up to, and then people will come to you once they know more about what you're doing and how it aligns with their work. Also attend events that your stakeholders attend. So here in Montana, we have the Montana Nonprofit Association, and there are local networks of nonprofit networks in different areas across the state. So we have some, in Eastern Montana, the central area, Western Montana. So that's a good audience to be able to identify and see what kinds of events they're putting on, and how to attend those events, because then you will be, definitely in the area of, talking with people of like interests, other nonprofit organizations as well. Those are really important arenas for networking and building new relationships and partners. So if you're in Montana, you can actually find those local nonprofit networks on the Montana Nonprofit Association website. And of course, now in COVID times, we need to be building out virtual experiences and how we can connect to our stakeholder groups in a virtual setting. So how is the organization being innovative? Think about how you're being innovative in the ways that you reach out and connect, maintain connections with, and educate stakeholders in this virtual and socially distanced world. Because a lot of these other open participatory activities aren't necessarily options right now because of COVID, but nevertheless, they're important to keep in mind when our world opens up again. So I've been talking a lot. We're going to transition back to a chat question here. Let me stop sharing. And this question is asking you to think about or share what education strategies you've tried so far that were effective. So you can think about what you've done so far that has made a difference and helped you connect. Or now that you've heard some new information, hopefully, what might you want to try that's new? So you can either talk about something that you've tried already that's been effective to engage and educate your stakeholders, or a new approach that you might want to try. Okay. Presentations to community task forces, having a newsletter that goes out, terrific. Okay, a new approach, creating a newsletter to inform stakeholders, awesome. Surveys and flyers, doing more reports for the Board of Regents. Oh, webinars with panels, that's awesome. Sending out promotions for programming, nice, yeah. Help your audience know what's coming up. Keep them excited about the future, what's coming up. Yep, lots of uses of newsletter. Oh, and back to phone calls. Yes, we forgot the phone existed for a while maybe. So coming back to just calling individual people, having conversations with them over the phone. Lots of social media presence, it looks like. Connecting with clients with individualized contact, good. Presenting at monthly nonprofit meetings. Yep. Okay, yeah, sounds like doing lots of individual meetings. Yep. Growing the website, creating some new social media for a new organization. Free candy. Yep, candy's always good. Candy and pizza. those bring people out. Awesome. Website development. Okay. Nice. Work on the basics like a vision. Okay, yeah. So this is a good time to be building out some of those strategies and taking a time out, a pause to be able to build out 5-year plans, build out your performance metrics. What does your evaluation and assessment plan look like? Great. Connecting with service clubs to recruit volunteers. Awesome. Those are all really good examples of current and hopefully some new practices too that you can start to think about and be able to get involved with. So thank you for sharing. Those are great. See if I can get back to sharing my screen. Okay, here we go. All right, let's see. So with these new tools, new ideas, as you're reaching out to invite their participation, it's really important to be clear, explain what you need from them, the important role that they're going to play in helping your program and organization to achieve the goals and mission. And it can, one thing as you're reaching out to new stakeholders or growing current stakeholders is this can manifest into things like advisory groups that can help do the important work of programming, services, and ultimately the social change that you're trying to reach. So you could think about inviting people to an advisory committee, advisory board. That's something that will be more heavily discussed in one of the other CBI trainings, but it's good to give some thought about what the structure and duration of an advisory board might look like as a strategy to bring in new stakeholder groups and what that might look like for a particular project or program. Another thing that's important is to offer to help them. You don't always want to be asking, but also bringing something to the table, something to bear that will impact their organization. Do they have something, a need or an opportunity that you could engage with them to help them pursue their mission and make deeper impact? So what are those opportunities for reciprocal partnership development where each of you gets something out of the relationship, that partnership? Those are really important aspects to think about early on as well. And the other thing on there, I think, is, really demonstrating, being excited about working together, demonstrate that how by working together, the likelihood of success for the greater good is much more attainable. So having a positive message point, a positive energy around bringing people together and asking them to come into partnership with you for this important work can be sort of the icing on the cake for organizations that are, or individuals that are interested but may not yet be, kind of ready or able to make a commitment. So that's going to be really important as well, being confident about expected outcomes. So once you have some experience then working together, so this is kind of moving along that projected timeline of stakeholder involvement, things to think about would certainly be how working together and being successful in partnership can really help your program take those next leaps, the next big steps in where the organization wants to go programmatically and service-wise, and even, budget-wise. If one of your goals is to really increase your budget to support a brand new project, that's going to be something that you're going to be thinking about early on in a stakeholder relationship as well. So it's interesting to think about the kind of possibilities that are out there to really, when you are able to bring stakeholders together and collaborate and have reciprocal relationships. Think about how are you going to reach more people, reach more audiences, serve more people? How are you going to raise more money? Sometimes there's lots of examples of nonprofit organizations forming coalitions so they can go together in grant applications and demonstrate to grant makers that they are working together, collaborating to have a bigger impact and really maximize the investment dollars of a foundation grant. How could it help you engage more volunteers? Again, partnering with other groups and stakeholders will open the doors to other people that are also interested in similar work and service capacity. Ultimately, I think what we're driving for here is certainly greater community impact. That's a common large scale goal. And, you know, building up to then eventually, how do we actually move the needle on things like hunger and homelessness and poverty? How do we have deep impact on reducing the prevalence of this in our community and in our society in general? So those are some of the big picture things to be thinking about as stakeholders are coming into your organization. They're transitioning into, you know, awareness, action, and then ultimately, how are the advocates and champions who are working side by side with you to be able to have the kinds of impacts that you want to be having through your programs. So let's see, we've got time for a couple more chat questions. So I will stop sharing. So the next chat question here is, I guess looking at the advocacy piece, since we kind of left off there. Are you aware of, or, you know, have you experienced yet, or maybe been aware of past impacts of advocacy work that your organization or your project has had in partnership with other stakeholders to influence maybe things like public policy, you know, or testifying to the legislature when the legislature is doing their budgeting for different types of service industries? So and this doesn't necessarily have to connect to the work you're doing right now, because I realize some of you are kind of new to your service, but think about examples of how you've seen nonprofit organizations or community efforts have an impact on advocacy and the kinds of work that organizations do. I'm not sure that I'm articulating that question super clear, but let's see what we see in the chat here. What ways have you, or what examples of success have you seen, I guess, in terms of partnering with the organizations and stakeholders to build advocacy and impact? It's a harder one for sure. Okay. Thank you, Ingrid. So yes, your organization's partnering now to make childcare more accessible and free in Montana. That is a huge need, especially in COVID times. So yeah, that's huge. Have you seen any indicators of small successes yet? I guess with that particular example, that would be nice to hear if you've got some of that. And yeah, thanks, Kaz. So yeah, other organizations who've been at this longer, because I know you're in a new organization, be willing to help and offer suggestions and create contacts. Raising organization profile by getting supporters to nominate the organization for community recognition. That's huge. That's a big aspect of raising awareness, is when your organization can be nominated and recognized for the great work it's doing. That's where you see a lot of new people you know, coming into the awareness of what your organization is doing. All right, Citizens Climate Lobby. So this is a place where you volunteer, Rachel, great. And yeah, it's all about building relationships at the grassroots, yep, grass and the grass tops, and bipartisan. Those are really critical strategies as well, grassroots, grass tops, and bipartisan across the board. That's awesome. All right. Connecting with local service providers for COVID specific services. Great. Addressing service gaps. And Sarah, yeah, it looks like stakeholders, you've had good success with stakeholders promoting the project. That's awesome. And working with the community garden. Nice. Okay, good. Well, thank you. Those are some really good examples. And I think what I would like to maybe challenge you to think about is, you know, as you continue your work in this area and you continue kind of analyzing the role, functions, purposes, you know, the hope for, expectations of stakeholder partnerships, think about it from this perspective, like how can the voices of many players in an environment, in an audience of, say, homelessness or food insecurity, how can advocacy efforts be even, you know, I guess, more heightened, and as a result of that, see greater impact when there's many voices that are collaborating in a same message, perhaps to a legislative body or to a city council that might be making funding decisions too. So, all right. So I know, there is a fine line, I should say, between advocacy and lobbying. And obviously, as national service participants, you cannot cross that line into lobbying. But advocacy is really all about educating people. And that's really the focus of what I hope you're getting from this conversation and from the presentation today. So I guess I will transition back one more time to the slides. And then we'll wrap it up. So with this, all right, so I guess in closing, like I said, I really hope that this will help you build a framework to think about the importance of stakeholder groups and the work that you do and how you can reach out to and connect with stakeholders. The work that you put into identifying your stakeholders, understanding their importance and the roles that they play will help you manage relationships among stakeholders and be able to build a comprehensive or strategic communication strategy to help educate them, engage them in the work, and turn them into advocates with you, your allies and your champions. So hopefully this information is somewhat practical in concept, I guess. My hope is that you'll be able to turn around some of this right away and think about the stakeholder groups that you're engaging with or who you'd like to reach out to. And talk with the folks at your placement sites about this idea or your ideas right now too. And maybe share that matrix with them. I think that would be an interesting exercise to do as a group within your organization, because different people probably have different perceptions within the organizations of the stakeholders and their roles. And that would be normal based on staff roles. Staff in certain areas of the organization may have a different expectation of stakeholder audiences than other staff that have different kinds of responsibilities. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your time. My contact information is here on the screen, and I'm happy to have you reach out to me if you want to talk about any of this further or have questions or areas of clarification. We do have a few minutes. I will stop sharing my screen now, and you can ask questions either in the chat or raise your hand as well. So yeah, just really appreciate your time and your service. It's a big commitment, and you're making a huge difference in communities across the state and the country.